I was gone for 1 year, just 1 year, working out of state, handling a long construction contract, thinking everything back home would stay exactly the same, but the moment I drove back onto that dirt road, something felt wrong there, felt different. The land felt unfamiliar, like it didn't belong to me anymore. This wasn't just land to me, this was my grandfather's legacy, hundreds of acres passed down through generations. Every fence line, every tree, every inch had a story. So when I saw rooftops in the distance, my first thought was simple: wrong turn, but I hadn't taken a wrong turn, was exactly where I was supposed to be. In those rooftops, they weren't supposed to be there. As I got closer, the reality started hitting me harder. Perfect house, fresh pavement, street signs, landscaping so clean it looked like a magazine. Right in the middle of my property, stepped out of my truck and just stood there staring, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. Then I saw the sign, Silver Creek Estates HOA. I actually laughed for a second because it sounded like a joke. HOA on my land. That's when I realized that this wasn't a mistake. Acres drove past me like I didn't exist. People looked at me like I was out of place, like I didn't belong there. That feeling, standing on your own land and feeling like a stranger, that does something to you. We didn't waste time. I went straight to their office, walked in, covered in dust, boots still dirty from the road. They looked at me like I was lost. Told them exactly who I was, told them this land belonged to me. They didn't even flinch. They said they bought it legally, said everything was approved. Said I must be confused. That word stuck with Mezzo. I asked to see their paperwork. They handed it over like it was nothing. Clean documents, maps of patrol, looked official, but something felt off. So I pulled out my folder. Old leather worn from years. Inside was the original deed, signed long before any of them ever showed up. He placed it on the desk, and that's when everything changed. The room got quiet. You could see it in their face that moment when confidence turns into doubt. Didn't argue, didn't raise my voice, didn't make a scene. He just walked out. Beckus, at that moment I knew something they didn't. They had made a mistake, and not a small one. That night I sat in my truck going through every document, every boundary line, every signature, and then I found it gap. They never completed the ownership transfer properly. They built first, filed later, and legally thought changes everything. The next morning the neighborhood looked peaceful again. Kids outside, cars parked neatly, lawns perfectly trimmed, but underneath all of it, none of it was security. Didn't go back alone. Brought someone who understood the law better than anyone, who went through everything again, line by line, and the conclusion was clear. They had built an entire community on land they didn't legally own. Went back through that neighborhood again, but this time it felt different. He wasn't confused anymore. He wasn't questioning anything. He knew exactly where I stood. Delivered the notice. No arguments, no shouting, just paper off shoulder and far. That's when everything started to shift. They called meetings, brought in lawyers, started digging through their own documents, and the deeper they looked, the worse it got. Residents started hearing rumors, questions started spreading, doubt started growing. That perfect image they built, it started cracking. Eventually phone rang. They wanted to talk. Was sat down in the same room as before, but that this Timothy weren't relaxed. Said they were carefully, didn't demand anything. G offered terms, simple terms. If they wanted to stay, they would paymently, land usage back payments, legal agreements, moving forward, everything structured, everything clean. They didn't like it, but they understood it, because the alternative was worse, way worse. At that moment when the contract was sitting on the table, you could feel the pressure in the room. Nobody spoke. Beckhouse, everyone knew what was about to happen. Then the pen moved slow, wrecked, and finally signed in. Just like fate, writing changed. He picked up the papers. Count quieto, celebration, no reaction. Best, this was never about revenge. This was about ownership, about respect, about knowing what's yours and standing your ground. He walked out of that office the same way I walked in the first time, but this time I wasn't the outsider. No, every house, every street, every perfect lawn at on my land, and every single one of them came with a processo. Tell me, you had would you have done in my place, and where are you watching this from?